Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, Simon, and welcome to this talk about making the best of the built environment for butterflies and moths. Now, before I get stuck in, just a little bit about my background. I worked for 25 years as what I think is affectionately known as the county ecologist in Dorset. So for local government in Dorset, I was their principal ecological advisor. And over that period, I got involved in a number of large scale projects, which were all about creating habitat for wildlife and particularly grassland habitats. Associated with road schemes, with landfill sites, quarry restorations. And it gave me a great insight over a very long timescale to see what the effects are, warts and all, of how to do things in the real world. We get a lot from an academic perspective of how we should recreate habitats, but actually to see it working on the ground, I think is really important. And for the last 4 years of my tenure at the County Council, I was put in charge of road verge management across the council. And that meant staff and resources and contracts and just under £1 million to spend on road verge management. And when you put an ecologist in charge of road verge management, say, as opposed to someone in the highways team, you end up with quite a different result. And so this talk is much about how I implemented changes for the benefit of wildlife through that mechanism. So let's look at this first slide. Which would people prefer? Would you like this or that? And it's pretty obvious, really, isn't it? The first slide shows a typical piece of amenity grassland managed by local government or whoever, where it's regularly mown. The clippings end up sitting on the turf and rot down very slowly. And frankly, it looks a mess and it regularly needs mowing. And if it isn't mown, people complain that it looks scruffy. This second one here, I beg to say that that looks scruffy. I think it looks productive from a wildlife point of view. I think it looks neat and tidy. And it is an emerging habitat in an urban environment. And not only that, it costs a fraction to manage of the area in the previous slide. So from my point of view, pretty obvious what we should be doing. But let's set this in some wider context, is that actually these days, we just don't want ordinary green grass just to line everything. We actually want a lot out of our urban green spaces because these are providing that sort of phrase, the ecosystem services that we require in order to function as human beings, let alone giving space for biodiversity to survive and thrive for its own sake. So we want to see more biodiversity because it provides us with all sorts of things, not just enjoyment, but it provides us with pollination, with pollen for bees, with nectar for butterflies. It provides a range of resources in an urban environment. We also want our green spaces to help regulate temperature, and particularly in London, the heat island effect is a very serious and important effect which vegetation can ameliorate. And I think also importantly, health and well-being and a sense of place. We want to be able to turn up to an area and recognize where we are. And I think much of the landscaping that's been designed and put in place in our built environment looks very samey wherever you are in the country. Name me a supermarket where you can recognize exactly where you are in that supermarket car park as a result of the landscape that's been placed there. It's very rare to see a localized sense of place in where you are, and that has to change in my view. So what's really important is how we design our green spaces. And for the last 40, 50 years or so, we have undertaken a very traditional green space design, which is whenever machines move into an area, they dig away at the topsoil, they remove it, and you end up with a mineral base or a subsoil, and then 150 mil of topsoil is put onto every available piece of land that is going to be grassland into the future. It's a very standard cut and paste design across our urban environment. And the end result of that 150 mil of fertile soil sown with amenity grass is that it needs to be mown in order to keep it not only looking nice, although I beg to differ that this looks nice, but actually because it's safe to do so. Sometimes if you allow vegetation to grow, the vegetation flops out into the highway or across the footway, and that becomes a danger, a hazard. And so it's important from a highway point of view, and it's important from a public access across a park that the grass is maintained. But in the very act of the regular maintenance, we limit its wildlife value because nothing really gets a chance to flower, set seed, provide a nectar source, provide a food plant for a butterfly or a moth. And as a result, our amenity grasslands are spectacularly sterile for wildlife, and we have to do something about it. And what's critical in all of this is soil fertility. And soil fertility is a powerful driver of grass growth. And here are two photographs of the same road verge taken just about 100 meters apart back in April 2019. And on the left are where my former colleagues, engineering colleagues, had some topsoil and spread it on the new verge and sowed the amenity grass. And here in mid-April is the result of that. Some long grass that is now, part way up the lamp column, as you can see, and it needs to be mown. It needs mowing soon, otherwise it starts to become a danger because you can't see out of the junctions. On the right is exactly the same verge, 100 meters up, without any topsoil. It doesn't need any management at all. It's still green, but is doing just fine, thank you very much, without any mowing, any need for mowing. Look back to the left and you see there are, two dandelions and a daisy? And on the right, loads of daisies and dandelions, and there are celandines and all the rest of it in there. Low fertility means that you end up with fine grasses and lots of gaps for germination for herbs. And that tells you quite a lot about the grassland ecosystem that is driving biodiversity. Low fertility is what we want. And low fertility creates high biodiversity in the natural world. So our very best grasslands for wildflowers, for wildlife, are where we've got the lowest nitrogen in the soils. So if we think of our chalk downlands, our sand dunes, our limestone grasslands, those are the sorts of habitat, or acid grasslands even, those habitats are very low in fertility and very high in species diversity of plants. And then as a result of that, very high in diversity of the different trophic levels of animals that are above that. And the reason for that is the coarse grasses, which normally suck up all the nutrients and grow big and shade out, they're present in this system, but they can't find the nutrients they're after. So they can't outcompete and they can't dominate. And it's as simple as that. So low fertility equals high biodiversity. Now, what we need to know is, does this work in practice? So can we, on a sensible scale, in our built environment, do something about that, do something with that, change the original standard traditional specification that said everything has to be covered in 150 mil of topsoil? My chance to do this was in the construction of the Weymouth Relief Road in Dorset from 2009 to 2011 in advance of the London Olympics, where Weymouth held on to the sailing events. And I had a chance as part of the design and construction team to include low fertility verges on 7 hectares of land attached to the road. And the very maximum amount of topsoil I allowed anywhere, as you can see in this shot, was just a sprinkle, 15 millimeters or less. And in many areas, no topsoil at all. So it was subsoil only, or the bare mineral. So that was bare limestone or clay or sand. And then onto that, I sowed, that was all done by hand, a modest mix of wildflowers, most of the species of which you will recognize as classic chalk grassland species. But in amongst that is one species that I say is a pioneer. It's a very important species in that it performs an important function more than its wildlife value, because it establishes very quickly, flowers very quickly, and makes a spectacular alternative to grass. And of course, you all know this. It's kidney vetch. Kidney vetch is the classic, brilliant pioneer plant that within, well, if it were sown in the autumn, on a mild autumn, within a week, the seedlings are up. And then within 6 months, the following spring, it's flowering. So just a matter of 6 to 10 months after sowing the seed, you've got flowers of kidney vetch coming up. And where you've sown it with a reasonable amount of that, you've got it in profusion. And it looks spectacular very, very early in the scheme. And I think part of our reluctance to include wildflowers in amenity grasslands is because when the scheme first opens, whether it's a new building development, whether it's a new road or playing fields or whatever, we want to have them looking neat and tidy for when the mayor or the dignitary opens and cuts the ribbon. And therefore we only want grass. And then we leave that legacy of grass for somebody to manage forever. However, if we were to include wildflowers, it could look like this. But as you know, kidney vetch is very important, the only food plant for the small blue butterfly. And the small blue moved into the Weymouth Relief Road in 2012, barely 18 months after first sowing the seed. So here, this tiny butterfly that we think it needs help. The help it needs is just provide the food plant and provide it in abundance wherever you can. And that butterfly found it. The nearest colony of small blue to the Weymouth Relief Road before construction was 4 miles away. So it had found this habitat within 18 months. So it's quite a good disperser despite its size. And now we have a huge population, and I'll show you some data on that in a minute. But the Relief Road verges are superb. I mean, here's horseshoe vetch, which is often said to be a difficult species to establish. In my experience, not at all. In Dorset, I found it quite easy to establish on chalk and limestone rubble. And here, all of these patches just were hand sown a very small amount of seed, and it's gone berserk. And Adonis blue moved in very quickly after a couple of years. It's taken a lot longer for Chalkhill blue to move in, and Chalkhill blue is a rare species in Dorset. Somehow, we don't know why, in huge decline, except on Portland. And it's almost certain that the colony that's just establishing now on the Relief Road has flown that 11-mile journey to get to the Relief Road. So even across the totally inhospitable environment that you can see, and Portland's in the far distance in this photo, even that, this butterfly can make it and has made it. So a wonderful story that I think should give us great hope that if we create the habitats at scale, we can attract back the species that we so dearly love and want to see in the future. Now, that verge that I showed you of the kidney vetch, this is the same verge last year at the end of May, early June. Absolutely plastered with pyramidal orchids. Wonderful, stunning, stunning views. I mean, spectacular, way beyond my expectations. I included pyramidal orchid seed in the mix because it's a roadside orchid and it sometimes comes up in places. But I did not expect, I mean, you could see tens of thousands. There were probably hundreds of thousands of these orchids all over the verges. It's amazing. And plant diversity, now having sown 30 species of seed, there are now 141 species of plant on the verges and 30 species of butterfly, which is about half the breeding list. Now, they're not all breeding on these verges, but most of them are, or most of them are probably temporarily resident, at least on there. So it's a real success. And just think, this road is barely 10 years old. But let's just come back into the middle and look at the middle slide there of the pyramidal orchids. Nobody has touched that verge since I walked on there to throw the seed. It has not had one mower anywhere near it It is totally unmanaged in the 10 years since it was created. And that, not only do you have the biodiversity, but you also have the spectacular lack of management. That site needs nothing doing to it, and probably won't need anything doing to it for the next 10 years. So back to the butterflies. The bars are the numbers of species that have been recorded over the site. So you can see how since 2012, there was a fairly steep rise in the number of species, and we've now plateaued at about 30. Not all species recorded every year, but I reckon that over the next 10 years or so, maybe one or two more will come in. We don't have green hairstreak, for instance, or dark green fritz. I suspect they will arrive in due course. But we're probably going to end up with maybe in the next 20 years, 36 species or so. But I think that's pretty good. The total count of butterflies started very low, but is still relatively steadily going up. Of course, there are peaks and troughs. But overall, look at the biomass of butterflies. I mean, there are thousands of butterflies there every year. And a dear person from Natural England was in tears when she was walking down the path through all these butterflies. She'd never seen so many marbled whites around her feet. This type of habitat creation can be spectacularly successful and way, way beyond my expectations. But it's not just the numbers of butterflies, the biodiversity. Let's go back to that management, because that tells us something. If you don't put topsoil on the verges, you don't have to use energy, fuel, in putting that topsoil on the verge, and nor do you have to use energy, fuel, in mowing the verge. And I've been working with Dr. Sarah Wynne from ADAS to convert the prescription that we used on the Weymouth Relief Road and to compare that with a standard prescription for management of a similar type of verge under the traditional design, and to compare those two in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously for where you don't have any topsoil and you don't have any mowing, which is the small pale blue bar on the right, your greenhouse gas emissions in terms of management are almost minimal. But if you look at the bar on the left, the dark blue is the amount of energy used, the fuel used in spreading the topsoil. And then the pale blue bar is the amount of energy used in mowing the verge for 20 years, twice a year. And you can see just how much diesel is used in doing that. And there's a middle one in there where if the verges were mown once every 4 years, which is a bit of a sort of standard motorway prescription, that gives you the sort of middle range. But overall, between the low topsoil and the standard, that's a 97% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And for all of us who are now desperate to get our carbon down to net zero, this is a really important message to be carrying forward. So that's construction. So I think it's blindingly obvious how we should be able to influence the design of our major schemes and indeed our minor schemes. This can go down to the creation of a butterfly bank in a back garden or in a school grounds or in a public park. It doesn't have to be huge scale, but we just need more bare mineral creations to be able to create sites for wildflowers and butterflies. But can we retrofit this low fertility approach to existing amenity grasslands? And the answer is yes, we can. What we have to do is we have to change from the cut and drop mowing to cut and collect, where as we cut the grass, we collect up the arisings and take them away. Let's think about it. If you allow the grass, which you can see in this picture, to grow long, where is it getting its nutrients? Where's it getting its nitrogen from? Is from the soil. So if you take away the nitrogen that's bound up in the green leaves and the flowers and the seeds during the growing season, can't go back into the soil. So you deplete the soil, and if you allow the grass to grow really long before you cut it, you deplete it really quickly. And that is the key to reducing the fertility of existing grasslands by cut and collect. And it has a very dramatic effect. Now let's just have a look. So here is those same bits of verge just down from my house. In April 2019, here is this same picture of the verge with the grass growing partway up the lamppost. Since April 2019, this verge has been on a cut and collect regime. So here is the picture that I took yesterday of the same verge in the same location. Look how dramatically the grass has basically stopped growing. Now, I know we're in a bit of a cold spring and perhaps it hasn't grown as much, but there is no way that the grass will ever grow again as high as it does in that left-hand slide. So we're already on that pathway really quickly. So in the left-hand slide, that was cut 5 times a year on a cut and drop. And on the right-hand side, it's now on a 2 or 3 cuts a year of cut and collect, dramatically reducing the grass growth. And here's that same picture 50 meters up. And you can see in 2019, it didn't need cutting. In this year, it still doesn't need cutting. It just occasionally needs a quick skim over with the mower. It's still performing its function. There are no big bare patches or anything. It's still nice green grassland, but it's full of wildflowers. And one of the things I've noticed this year are bee orchid rosettes, and there are quite a few of them scattered over this rather sparse turf. And these sites, they've had no additional seed or anything. They're just acquiring biodiversity that's in the area. It's a wonderfully simple and cheap system to be able to increase biodiversity. And this is Nowheresville. This is outside. This is in the background is Weymouth football ground, and we're right next to a trading estate in Weymouth. There is nothing special about this area, but this verge is starting to become special and full of interesting wildflowers. It's got brown argus and common blue on there, and there are also plenty of meadow browns and gatekeepers as well. So it's starting to perform an ecological function in a site that was previously just mown grass. So the process of doing this, my advice is to go in there fast and furious. Is in that first year you want to convert from cut and drop to cut and collect mowing, you go in there and allow the grass to grow as tall as possible before you cut it, and you cut it 3 times. And in doing so that's April, July and September in southern England. Perhaps in Scotland that might be twice, maybe in end of May and the end of August. But if you do that 3 times in any one year in southern England, you will have changed the grass composition. You can see that this site, which was mown 3 times in 2017, in mid-May in 2018, this still didn't need any cutting. It was ordinary, boring, long grass in previous years. Now, as a result of that cut and collect, full of daisies and dandelions and things, and fine grasses, and hardly any tall grasses. And that's a transformation in one season of cut and collect mowing. Dramatic effect. And let's just have a look at a few of these sites. So here's one where the verge was last cut in June 2019. This is in Blandford, and that photo was taken in mid to late October. So from June to mid-October, no need for mowing. And given it's got to October, it won't be mown now until the following spring in 2020. So effectively, you've cut the amount of mowing that ever needs to be done. It's still perfectly safe, and it's starting to acquire some biodiversity. You can see bits of yarrow, and maybe there are a few other bits and pieces in there, some buttercups, starting to get into the sward. Come back to Simon's opening picture, and this is an ordinary boring verge in Weymouth, constructed out of clay soils with amenity grass and 150 mil of topsoil. After 4 years of cut and collect, the nutrients have been reduced so much in that verge that there's hardly any grass that you can see, but what grasses there are fine grasses, and it's full of wildflowers. There's rough hawkweed in there, lots of oxeye daisy and daisies and dandelions. And what do you bet? I bet you in the next couple of years, there'll be pyramidal and bee orchids growing in there too. I don't see why not. They're now pretty widespread on verges throughout the town. It's a remarkable change and something that is perfectly possible to achieve absolutely anywhere. This does not need to be done on nice chalk everywhere. You can do it on almost any soil type. But when you do it on chalk, this moving from a cut and drop to a cut and collect regime, here is the Blandford bypass. This is the A354 main road around Blandford. After 5 years of cut and collect, this site has become such an important chalk grassland that the Dorset Wildlife Trust have declared it a county wildlife site. Now, I think that is a real mark of achievement in that change in approach. This site used to be cut and dropped 3 times a year, and indeed they had to do a ragwort pull. As soon as I got in post, we changed it all, and we changed it onto that, and it's now 1 cut and collect a year is all that's required. So a dramatic change in the amount of mowing and in the fate for wildlife on the verge. And just one more from Littlemore in Weymouth. Here's this opening slide of this is a site which was derived from agricultural soil, so almost no wildflower seed in it naturally at all. And after that first harsh season of cut and collect, at the end of that season, sowed it with a very simple wildflower mix. 18 months later, the wildflowers in what was originally gang-mown grassland starting to take shape. So this ordinary bits and pieces of triangles and shapes of grassland will be full of common butterflies, of ringlet and meadow brown and gatekeeper and common blue, marbled white, just bumbling around in the middle of Weymouth. It's lovely to see that into the heart of our towns and cities we can bring some, yes, commonplace wildlife, but commonplace it should be for everybody to enjoy. And it doesn't just have to be long stuff either. Cut and collect puts you in control of the ecosystem, of that grassland ecosystem. So if you want fine grasses and a neat mown sward, then cut and collect, but don't do it as regularly as you might your back lawn. If you want something that you're going to cut every week, just leave it for a month. Mow it every month, maybe. Plant Life are encouraging people to have a no-mow May and go and count and look at the wildflowers that are in the lawn. I kind of prefer that no-mow May to August because I think that's kind of rather better for the critters we're interested in. But look at this sward here, which is full of small hawkweeds and birdsfoot trefoil and various a whole range of herbs, and there are brown argus and small and common blue that can be seen from time to time flying over this grassland, suggesting that they're using this resource as a breeding site. And this is mown grassland, mown municipal lawn outside social housing in Weymouth. It can happen. We really can bring wildlife right into the heart of where people live and work. Now, there are plenty of issues, and I'm sure we can discuss those, but what's really important is that those issues are all resolvable. Where do you chuck the arisings? How far do you have to take them to dispose of them? Well, for the staff that I was in charge of, I said, you do not dispose of that grassland any further than you absolutely have to. If you've cut it on the highway, you leave it on the highway, and therefore it is not a waste product. Effectively, I've asked people to find areas of trees and scrub and new tree planting schemes where the grass cut can be used as a mulch, which then helps to convert those nutrients into above ground carbon. So effectively, we're creating an above ground carbon source somewhere else and not having to mow the grass instead. So there are some pretty key do's and don'ts that I've just talked to you about as to what we should be doing. Well, the first thing we have to do is to think about reducing soil fertility. That's how we're going to get the most sustainable way to get wildlife to thrive. And I've included this photo of Burgess Park. This is what happens if you simply let grass grow. You say you stop mowing. So it ends up 1 meter, 4 foot high, and it's extremely difficult for whether that's highway staff or rangers to go in there and manage that at the end of the year. Most staff do not have the kit that can cope with that long dead thatch at the end of the season. So it does make it very hard. So while we're all keen on local authorities mowing less, we don't actually mean stop mowing, because if we do, we end up with that. And while that does have wildflowers in it, the future of that is just long, rank grass in the longer term. And once we've set that, we need to find out where those areas and keep them managed properly for their wildlife. But there are 2 things that I really would ask you to resist. And the first is that, please, for our butterflies and moths at least, is please don't plant widely these pictorial meadow mixes. They look spectacular. They absolutely bring joy to our hearts, but they do very, very little for our butterflies and moths. For example, for our what we commonly assume as our native red poppy, which isn't actually a native species to our shores, there are no butterflies and moths associated with the red poppy. So it's not a species that offers anything to the things that we love so much. So minimize the amount of annual mixes that you're planting or encouraging your local authority to plant. The other thing we need to do is to keep people informed. Now, I don't know about you, but I think if I was really keen on my community spaces, and most people look at community spaces through their car windows, you could describe those verges as unmanaged, unloved, and that the local authority was not discharging its responsibility seriously. In reality, those verges are full of wildflowers, and I look at them thinking, fantastic, we're getting somewhere. But not everybody agrees with that. So what is important is that we need to keep our communities informed as to what's going on, to let them know, to have their say, because it doesn't have to look like that. We can have short wildflowers if we really want them, but I prefer them a little bit longer, obviously. But nonetheless, it's really important. And Dorset Council have, and the fact they've just relaunched their campaign of Love Your Verge, hashtag Love Your Verge in 2021 this year. Now, I've talked about budget savings and how much by how much you can reduce the amount of mowing. And overall, Dorset Council staff reckon that from a highway verge management program, which in urban areas used to be, when I took on the service, was about 6 times a year, every verge would be cut in all the urban areas across Dorset. The numbers of cuttings is now reduced to either 2 or 3 cut and collects a year, and that has taken just a matter of 2 to 3 years. And as a result of that, the staff have been absolutely able to hand back money to the authority. We don't need this anymore to cut verges. Please go and spend it on more important people-based services. And when I took on the service, I had £927,000 in the budget. When I left, I only needed 680,000 to run that service, and that was in 2017-18. And the verge budget for Dorset Council this year in 21-22 is 501,000. It won't be long before this low fertility approach to the highway verge management in Dorset can be delivered at half the cost that it was back in 2014-15. And I think that is a remarkable story, and one that just shows the power of working with the grain of nature, with the ecological system that's driving grass growth. Much of this, if you want any more guidance on this sort of thing, it's set out in Plant Life's Managing Grassland Road Verges, and Plant Life have recently reissued their Good Verge Guide, which is a more digestible version of that, and both of them are good reads. And if you type in Good Verge Guide or Managing Grassland Road Verges into into Google, you will get Plant Life's documents up. But I also draw your attention on the right to a fairly recent instruction that Highways England has issued at the end of last year. And that's, I've been working with Highways England in my building sites project now for the last 3 years, and getting on very well with them. And they have just issued what's known as a major project instruction on low nutrient grasslands. Every major Highways England project, so this is only England, but every major project will be adopting the low nutrient grassland approach that I advocated and carried out on the Weymouth Relief Road. And indeed, Highways England used the Weymouth Relief Road scheme as their main flagship project. And that means, love them or hate them, the next 300 miles of road which are planned in this country, all the grasslands will be based on low nutrient status. And that means we are going to have, if those road projects go ahead, another 300 miles of grassland habitat ready and waiting to be populated by our common and widespread species, which I think is a fantastic legacy of the project work that I'm doing. And if roads are going to be built, then we need to make them as best as possible and as permeable as possible for wildlife. And congratulations to Highways England for having done that. They don't just see the wildlife benefit, but they also see the safety benefit of not having to have staff out on the roads at night cutting the verges, and indeed the cost saving is enormous to the public purse of managing the 3,000 miles of highway network. So the more they can introduce this system, the cheaper it is to look after our trunk road and our motorway network. Just before we leave, just a little word on human health. I think those of us who are into our management of our downlands and our grasslands, we love to go out and help if we can, to be able to manage the scrub, to go out and enjoy, get a walk there, do our transit walks, photograph the butterflies and moths that are out there. But it goes a bit deeper than that. Clearly, there are these self-reported benefits of well-being that we derive from being out in a nice, diverse environment. But there are deeper positive associations between species diversity and well-being. And one of those possible mechanisms is to do with your gut microbiome, which for those of you who've been following King's College London over the pandemic will know just how important the microbiome is in terms of leaving you in a better state to be able to cope with infectious diseases, which includes COVID. And while the evidence is not strong, and I give you a couple of references at the bottom, there is reasonable evidence that a decrease in microbiome diversity, your gut flora, is correlated with an increase in prevalence of chronic inflammatory diseases. And we don't know if that's causal particularly, but it could be. But my view is, why do we have to wait for this evidence? The potential risk of including wildflowers in our urban environment is extremely low, but the benefit, the potential benefit at a population scale through increased exposure to a diverse environment, which leads to a diverse microbiota within us, surely must be worth doing. So I think over the next 10 years, we're going to hear a lot more about diversity of urban habitats from a wildlife point of view and its contribution to human health. And I'll leave you with that one. So my conclusions are that really, by understanding grassland as an ecosystem, we really can both design and manage our agrenity grassed spaces much more successfully for wildlife. And they can still perform the functions that they need to in terms of highway safety and looking green and tidy. Wildflowers don't lead necessarily to untidiness. Low fertility is absolutely key, and that we know if we get that right, we'll deliver the wildlife, they can continue to perform their intended function, they can be neat and tidy, and they are demonstrably cheaper to the public purse to look after and can contribute to carbon reduction targets. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's all I want to say, and I'm very happy to take questions now, and I'll stop my share.